Continuing now with The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. We ended the last session in chapter 18 with the president entertaining a group of 10 conservative congressmen on the presidential yacht Sequoia with stories about his recent trips to the Middle East and Russia. So now we continue in chapter 18. Trim and well-tanned, John Dean, and that was on the evening of July 10th, 1974. Trim and well-tanned, John Dean arrived in the Judiciary Committee's hearing room just before 10 o'clock on Thursday, July 11th. He smiled and shook hands with St. Clair, then took his seat at the witness table. The president's allies had waited a year for an opportunity to question Dean under oath. To the White House, Dean was the tricky, conniving, quote, bottom-dwelling slug, as columnist Joseph Alsop had called him, who had dragged the president into the cover-up. St. Clair was ready. This would be the major Watergate bout, a classic battle between a great cross-examiner and a great witness. During the Army McCarthy hearings, St. Clair had watched as Joseph Welch destroyed McCarthy in one burst of righteous anger. He hoped for a similar triumph. Dorr was first, and Dean's responses were cool, refined, and detailed. He was in full control of the chronology of events, remembering details as precisely as he had the previous summer at the Senate Watergate Committee hearings. At 2:10 p.m., St. Clair began his questioning. He focused immediately on the linchpin of his defense, that Nixon had not approved the $75,000 payment Howard Hunt received on March 21st. He looked at the committee as he spoke, a technique used by trial lawyers to unnerve a witness and remind the jurors of their duty. In his research, St. Clair had come upon an astounding statement made by Dean to the Senate committee, a statement that by itself he was convinced was sufficient to take the president out of the chain of events leading to the $75,000 payment. He picked up the green paper-bound volume of Watergate Committee testimony and read from page 1423. It referred to the president's meeting with Dean on March 21st. And a footnote adds, when Dean testified before the Watergate Committee, he mistakenly said that the meeting had taken place on March 13th. Dean had testified, quote, and the money matter was left very much hanging in that meeting. Nothing was resolved, end quote. Do you recall testifying to that? St. Clair asked. Yes, Dean said, with regard to... St. Clair interrupted. Is that the truth? He asked sharply. Yes, it is, Dean replied, with regard to the raising of $1 million. I didn't think there was anything resolved as to how to raise $1 million. St. Clair had erred. There had been two money issues discussed during that meeting. The possibility of eventually raising $1 million to pay off all the burglars, and Hunt's immediate demand for $120,000, of which $75,000 was paid the same day. Dean had never claimed that the issue of raising the $1 million was resolved. But St. Clair, still confused, repeated Dean's quotation from the green volume. Is that the truth? He demanded again. I will stand on my last answer, Mr. St. Clair. Aware that he had turned the point to his advantage, Dean rubbed it in. Until his meeting with the president, he said, he had refused to take part in any decision leading to payment of more money to the burglars. I had gone in with the intent of trying to turn off the payment to Hunt, he explained. I came out having been turned around. The president felt it was desirable. The questioning proceeded. Dean continued to demonstrate his superior knowledge and understanding of the record. Several times he corrected St. Clair on dates or names. At one point, St. Clair asked Dean about a question John Mitchell had raised with the president. Well, Dean corrected, I testified that Mr. Ehrlichman raised the question. It would be a lot easier if you would just answer yes or no if you could, St. Clair snapped. You know, time marches. I understand, said Dean. Thank you, St. Clair responded coolly, as if he had finally won a point. But, Dean interjected, I want the committee to have the full information I have. I gather that, St. Clair said. Now just answer the question. Several members of the committee raised objections to St. Clair's manner. He was attempting to browbeat the witness. St. Clair became defensive. My only point is, Mr. Chairman, that the answers have been very extensive and to a great extent not responsive. But I will not raise the point. I will go ahead. To St. Clair it seemed ludicrous that a witness as important as Dean would be cross-examined for only half a day. Now he was getting speeches from Dean, but no answers. Dean's a smart bastard, St. Clair said to himself, but let us endure his speeches, and eventually he'll put his foot in his mouth. The chair asked St. Clair to repeat his question. "I must apologize," he said. "May it be read? I don't recall the question." Dean was ready. "I can save time," he said. "I recall the question and the answer I was going to give." "Is that satisfactory, Mr. St. Clair?" asked the chairman. "Yes," St. Clair answered helplessly. Dean repeated the question and answered it. St. Clair tried to pick up the thread. Did Ehrlichman report the conversation in question to the president on the afternoon of the 21st? That conversation had occurred on the morning of the 22nd, Dean corrected him again, so it would be impossible to report it on the afternoon of the 21st. The question was not terribly important, but St. Clair realized he had been outfoxed. He could only say, "I am sorry, I misspoke." The president's lawyer never recovered. At 4:35 that afternoon, he completed his interrogation. It was now the members' turn. As they questioned Dean for 5 minutes each, St. Clair sat slumped in his chair, his head tilted back, staring at the ceiling. He closed his eyes several times. He had lost his chance to give his Joe Welch speech and crush John Dean. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 18, and we continue now with Chapter 19 of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. David Eisenhower liked to play games. During the first Nixon term, he and the president frequently played a game of pocket billiards they called golf. Balls were set before each of the 6 pockets and one on the cue spot, and the object was to sink all 7 balls in as few shots as possible. Once the president had done it in 3, but he had stopped playing in 1971. As the second Nixon term progressed, David played games more and more. He would get a wiffle ball game going on the White House tennis court with some of the staffers. The object of the game, called Home Run Derby, was to hit the ball over the fence. Sometimes he convinced Julie to play. David and Julie also played a lot of bridge, and David loved the board game Diplomacy, which he always won. But his favorite was the American Professional Baseball Association game, a computer-designed contest in which the participants served as the team managers. Complicated sets of cards listed the hitting, fielding, and pitching averages for players of every American and National League team dating back to the 1950s. By adjusting the lineups, knowing the real team's weaknesses and strengths, David was able to win 10 or 15 more games in a given session than the actual team had won. He often played alone or with his law school classmate, Brooks Harrington, the 6'2" former college football player who was a political liberal. In the late spring and early summer of 1974, David was spending up to 3 or 4 hours a day playing APBA baseball. And I remember the ads for this game in the Sporting News and Sports Illustrated, maybe the Sporting News, I think. I really wanted this game, never got it, but I really thought about it at the time. His fascination with baseball, he had spent the previous summer as a sports writer for a Philadelphia paper, was regarded with derision by many on the White House staff. Seeing him walk through the mansion in the late afternoon with a stack of law books under his arm, Tom DeCare of the press office joked, "David's home from Little League practice." Some of the others called him Jughead. But whatever the cost in esteem, the long hours over the baseball game or Diplomacy seemed to help keep the president's son-in-law at a certain distance from the problems of Watergate, which was what David wanted. Harrington, who became David's closest friend, didn't press him about Watergate, though the subject came up inevitably. When the edited transcripts were released in April, David said to him, "You and I both know how this is going to come out." During those same weeks when David was trying not to read the news magazines, Harrington would mention an article and David would ask to see it. He would go off with a copy of Time, read it, and come back shaking his head. David told Harrington, an ex-Marine, that he was thinking about going back into the Navy. He wanted to get away. He also mentioned it to his grandmother, Mamie Eisenhower. She almost leaped out of bed. She was so happy, David said. But that was really no better an escape than the hours playing games, he decided. David was coming to grips with something he hadn't fully realized when he married Julie, that he had become not only a member of the Nixon family, but a member of the Nixon administration. The luxuries, the travel, the status of serving as an unappointed presidential advisor had come with the marriage. Now that the administration was coming apart, so was everything else. Julie was so wound up in her father's defense that it was straining their marriage. Her devotion to her father was uncomplicated. Each damaging development was a technicality in her eyes, and she would tell David not to bore her with the facts. The president turned increasingly to Julie for her love and devotion and sustenance. David resented the situation. He wanted his wife back. He thought her illness earlier in the year, a tubular pregnancy, was psychosomatic. It had happened because she had gotten herself so worked up over what was happening to her father, David told Harrington. Mrs. Nixon was unhappy with David. "Why aren't you giving Julie support?" she wanted to know. "Julie was out in the front lines defending her father," Mrs. Nixon said, while David was in the library studying or off somewhere playing diplomacy. There had been shouting once, and David had stormed out of the room. He was fighting hard to draw a line where politics could stop, where family loyalty could stop, and his own personal morality and his own life could begin. It was hard to find that place. The president had wanted David to go on the trip to Russia and assist in briefing the press, but David declined. Instead, he took 6 weeks off after the spring semester to see if he and Julie could have a life of their own. He felt strongly that Watergate was going to have an unhappy ending, but he could not get the message through to Julie. Her unquestioning loyalty made it impossible to deal with events on their basic, real level, he thought. Her stubbornness was difficult to contend with. At times he imagined her as the heroine of a movie, the devoted daughter defending her embattled, innocent father. David, part of him at least, wanted to help prove her right. David's feelings about the Nixon administration were intensely personal. In 1968, he had written a memo to Nixon saying why he should run for president. The 68 victory was euphoric, but the 1972 victory celebration was not. David and the rest of the family knew that Watergate was doing something to the president, something awful. In 1973, they watched it eat away at him. "Being president ceased to be fun after Haldeman and Ehrlichman left," Nixon said. The next year was worse, for David too. "We're innocent," the president told him many times, and David was sympathetic to Mr. Nixon, as he always called him. He thought he could relate to the president's problems through an experience of his own when he was in the Navy. As Lieutenant Junior Grade aboard the USS Albany, he himself had once covered up a matter. One of David's collateral assignments on the ship had been to act as intelligence officer. When he took the job, he had signed for hundreds of classified publications. His signature attested that he had received the documents from the officer he relieved. There had been no time to check and see if they were all aboard, let alone to page-check each one as was normally required. When David had less than a month left on board, his immediate superior insisted that a full accounting of the 400-odd publications be made. On his first check, David was missing 30 of them. After a full search of the ship, there were still 10 missing. It was the worst 3 weeks of his life, he told his friends, filled with haunting visions of Portsmouth prison as he searched and searched. Finally, he found all but one. It was a secret publication about Russian infrared devices. He had signed for 4 printed copies and could find only 3. Desperate, David and another officer devised a complicated scheme to deceive the authorities. They burned an extra onion-skinned copy of the publication and said it had been one of the originals. Then they witnessed the proper report, saying that the missing copy had been routinely burned according to the regulations for disposing of extra classified material. Since David never knew what he had signed for, never knew if there were in fact 4 copies originally, he persuaded himself that it was possible he had done nothing wrong. Neither perhaps had his father-in-law. On the evening of July 11th, Brooks Harrington and his wife Carol, a Navy Lieutenant Junior Grade who was executive assistant to the head of the Navy Race Relations Unit, joined the Nixons, the Coxes, and the Eisenhowers aboard the Sequoia. It was a beautiful evening with the temperature in the upper 70s. They all sat topside sipping drinks. The president asked Carol Harrington where she and Brooks had met. It had been Guantanamo Bay Navy Base in Cuba, a fact which seemed to interest the president. How was the base set up, he wanted to know. Had there been any incidents with the Castro government? How many civilians worked there? Did Navy ships use it a lot? Was it good duty? Was it secure from attack? "Dick," Mrs. Nixon said finally, "tell them about the Russian trip." The boat ride had been arranged for that purpose. He spoke enthusiastically, especially about his personal relationship with Brezhnev, which he asked them not to discuss elsewhere. He painted a picture of 2 world leaders who shared certain conservative values about their own societies, about the nature of political leadership. He and Brezhnev were the only 2 members of the most exclusive club in the world. Only they could understand each other. Only they could understand the burden and weight of leading the 2 superpowers. Brooks winced. He thought the 2 leaders sounded like 2 bull moose Republicans who'd been to a Kiwanis lunch. "The Russians missed you," the president said pointedly to David. David felt guilty. Nixon mentioned a boat ride he had taken with Brezhnev and how he had almost frozen. It was so cold. He became momentarily distracted, lost in thought. The Sequoia continued down the Potomac and went under a bridge. Mrs. Nixon pointed out that there were happily no reporters lining the railing this time. Julie hovered around her father. "Do you feel okay, Daddy?" she asked. "Is the sun in your eyes? Do you want another drink?" He seemed to recede deeper into his own thoughts, acknowledging her questions only perfunctorily. Harrington asked the president whether politicians in Russia had to court the military to gain power. The question reawakened Nixon's interest. No, he said, and he began talking about the nature of the military. When you make a suggestion or proposal to the American military, he explained, they say no, they say they can't do it. He cited the 1970 invasion of Cambodia as an example. The military had wanted to hold back, he said. They had thought the operation was too risky and of limited value. He was the driving force, Nixon said, the one who had to say, do it. The conversation was relaxed and pleasant as the Sequoia continued downstream. Then David inadvertently alluded to the disclosure of the president's taping system. The Nixon daughters flinched. The president withdrew again, and the discussion became awkward. Fortunately, it was time for dinner. The president walked to the head of the table and pointed to his left. Julie here, he said. Then he directed Julie here, he said. Then he directed Brooks to sit on his right. The steward served steaks. The president was still lost in his own thoughts, staring into his plate. Daddy, eat your steak, Julie said. He took a bite. Isn't this good steak? She asked. The others began talking uneasily about beef prices, watching for some reaction from the president. He continued to look at his plate while he picked at his food. The steward asked what they wanted for dessert. Julie turned to her father. Have some apple pie. He shook his head no. Have some ice cream, Daddy. No. She turned to the steward and said that the president would have some ice cream with chocolate sauce. Acquiescing, the president ate it. Wasn't the food good, she asked. It was okay, he said, not as good as last time. After dinner, they retired to the after cabin for more talk. A year earlier, the president had ordered that no magazines or newspapers be kept aboard. At the White House, only the sports section of the Washington Post was left each morning on the table by his door. The president asked Brooks and David what they thought of their generation. He was concerned that young people might want to quit making sacrifices. Brooks had worked to organize blacks and Indians in Oklahoma. But after the draft ended, everyone seemed to lose social consciousness, he said. No one wanted to give himself to anything larger than himself. The president nodded. David cited his classmates at Amherst. They had never complained about the war until they had gotten a low draft number. The president expressed concern about businessmen who apologized about being businessmen as if it were no longer a reputable profession. Too many Americans lived off government handouts, he said. Self-reliance might be outdated. Julie suggested that Brooks run for Congress. Both Brooks and David ought to run for Congress, the president said. He would vote for them both. He asked Brooks how old he was. 26. Wait until you're 32 and then make a move, Nixon advised. And so we come to the end of chapter 19, and we'll begin the next session with chapter 20. We're going to page 269, just about halfway through the book now. We're less than a month away from Nixon's resignation. So, July 11th, I believe these last events were July 11th or 12th, 1974. So, next time we'll take up with chapter 20 of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Thanks for watching.